Good evening and welcome to the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season and to our show, Tracking the Tropics. This is your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it's going to impact us. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and here's what we have planned for you tonight.
Hi, I'm Chief Meteorologist Tony Petrarca in Providence, Rhode Island. June 1st, the official start of the hurricane season. Last several seasons have been very busy, and so far we've had 2 named storms during the month of May. What will the outlook hold for this season? We'll get a closer look coming up.
I'm Melissa Lefevre in Raleigh, and here's what I've been working on. Of course, it's the official start of the Atlantic hurricane season, but we've already have 2 named storms. What could this mean for the upcoming 2020 season? I got the opportunity to speak with Ken Graham. He's the director of the National Hurricane Center, discussing everything from COVID-19, how it could impact operations and preparedness, as well as what he'll be looking for the upcoming season and what new products we could be seeing in the coming months. Be sure to stay tuned for all of that in just a bit.
And we'll get to both of our guests in just a minute. But today, the first day of the season, but already our 3rd system out there. This is breaking earlier today. If you'll remember from over the weekend, there was the potential for something to develop around central North Carolina. It's actually the leftovers of Tropical Storm Amanda from the Pacific side. Well, it now crossed over land, it weakened, and it reemerged on the Atlantic side in the Gulf of Mexico. And the National Hurricane Center classified it as Tropical Depression 3 a little bit earlier today. So it's just moved back over very warm water in the southern Gulf of Mexico. Winds were 30 miles per hour as of the 5 o'clock update from the Hurricane Center, gusting up to 40. And it's a slow mover, west-northwest at 7. And that'll be one of the characteristics of the rest of this week, the fact that it is slow moving. But this looks to be a Gulf storm. Again, the 3rd of the season. If we all remember, Arthur brought rain and strong wind gusts to the Carolinas 2 weeks ago. There was plenty of rain and rough surf on the North Carolina coast from Wrightsville Beach up to the Outer Banks. Thankfully, the storm did not cause any damage. Then, just last week, Tropical Storm Bertha brought rain and severe storms to the Carolinas. Bertha prompted several tornado warnings and at least 1 confirmed tornado in the mid-Atlantic associated with the outer rain bands. So what's going to happen with Tropical Depression 3? First of all, if it gets a name, it would be Cristobal. That's the C-named storm this year. But here's the forecast track, and it doesn't look like a normal track. It doesn't look like that cone. It looks like a big, giant circle, and that's because the track is going to be very slow moving, so there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's the possibility it could do a loop eventually by the middle of this week, possibly strengthening and becoming a tropical storm with 50-mile-per-hour winds. But then turning around and headed back into the northern Gulf of Mexico. That would be by Saturday. So in the course of the next 5 days, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of slow movement. And that's why it's more of a giant circle and blob instead of the cone that we might traditionally be used to. So again, if it does get a name, Tropical Depression 3, we've already got 2 checked off. The C-named storm is Cristobal. Here's the entire list of Atlantic storm names for the 2020 season. Again, the forecast is impressive. We'll jump into that a little later, so I have a feeling we're going to be checking off quite a few names on the list. So why is that storm expected to strengthen? Well, one of the reasons is the Gulf of Mexico water this time of year is very warm. Ocean temperatures this time of year, pretty much anywhere you see red, 80s and higher. So these warm waters will help promote more growth and strengthening of that system. But really, outside of what's going on in the Gulf of Mexico, there's not a whole lot else going on this time of year or right now as we look at the live tropical satellite. You know, later in the summer, once we get into July, August, and September, that's when things will start getting a little more active in the open waters of the Atlantic. That's when we'll start watching for those systems to come off the coast of Africa. But this time of year, we usually keep an eye on things close to home. That's where most of the formation is, in the Bahamas. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But if you think back to last year, remember, we ended up with 18 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes, category 3, 4, 5. And the average, you can see 12, 6, and 3. So we were above that or right on it pretty much in all categories. But do you remember the forecast for last year? The forecast for last year was 10 to 17 named storms, 5 to 9 hurricanes, and 2 to 4 of those becoming major. So the forecast for last year was already predicting above average activity, and that's exactly how we ended up. Now, usually this time of year, we don't have a lot to talk about. This is kind of a graph of when hurricanes form throughout the hurricane season, with most of the activity, and we all know this, happening in August and September. But June only has 2% of the hurricane activity. If Cristobal does indeed form, that would be the earliest on record that we have had the third named storm. So that graph shows one way about how tropical system and hurricanes form, when they form. How about where they form? So there's 3 places this time of year, and they all have to do with the warm waters. The Gulf of Mexico, this is one spot we'll see tropical activity form, and most times they move north and stay around the Gulf Coast, either Mexico, Texas, or Louisiana. The second spot is the Western Caribbean. Again, the trade winds, the warm water, very conducive for formation there in June. And then a lot of those storms get pushed into the Yucatan Peninsula, staying away from the United States. And the third and final spot that we typically see tropical systems form this time of year is around the Bahamas. And a lot of times, like we learned from Arthur and Bertha, a lot of times those storms will stay along or close to the coast of the Carolinas and Georgia and then push out to sea. So those are some of the places that we'll be keeping an eye on in the month of June. And that's what's going on right now in the tropics. But I'd like to welcome in our first guest of the night, meteorologist Melissa Lefevre. Melissa, you talked to the director of the National Hurricane Center, and from the pandemic to an early start to the season, they've already had their hands full.
Well, that's right, Wes. I spoke with Ken Graham, the director of the National Hurricane Center in Miami, about what we can expect this season, as well as how they are handling social distancing in the midst of the pandemic.
So we're doing everything we can here to listen to the recommendations of the CDC to make sure that we're safe, to perform our function. So everybody watching, you can count on us. We're going to be here, we're going to be healthy, and we're going to do what we have to do to perform our mission this hurricane season.
Oh, wonderful. Now, how would this come into play, this social distancing, if we did have a hurricane and people were needing to evacuate to a shelter? How would you guys approach that situation?
So listen to those local officials. If there's any adjustments, they're going to have those. But for the most part, the threat for a hurricane hasn't changed. If you're on the immediate coast, it's still knowing your zone. It's being able to get out of that storm surge. But even well inland, as you all know so much, and thinking about some previous hurricanes, that inland flooding, that inland part hasn't changed. So no matter what's going on, you still have to know your risk. You still have to be able to identify those risks and then write that plan to be able to keep yourself safe.
That's wonderful, and that's great advice. Now, what changes can we expect with the products and services going into the 2020 season?
One thing everybody is going to see on the actual forecast map is another dot. We've added another dot on there at 60 hours, and it doesn't seem like too big of a deal, but it really is, because what it does is it gives everyone another data point for not just the forecast, but the size of the storm. We use the size and the speed of the storm in the storm surge calculation. So that's going to be new information that everybody's going to have.
Are there any changes to the cone of uncertainty going into the new season?
Yeah, it's interesting with the cone. It's based on our error over the last 5 years. So the better we do, the smaller the cone, and it's really gotten smaller over the last couple decades. So it shrinks a little bit more, in fact. But we have to realize the smaller the cone, it's a good thing because our errors are smaller. But it also, remember, that means more impacts outside of the cone. So it's such a critical thing to remember. That cone is just where the center could be 2/3 of the time. The rainfall, the storm surge, the tornadoes, in some cases, could be 100 miles plus away from the center. So preparedness is everything. You know, it's one of those things that, you know, whether it's a busy season or not a busy season, if you get hit by a hurricane or even a tropical storm with torrential rain and storm surge, if it affects you, it's a busy season. So that early preparedness, it always circles back to that. Busy or not, we got to be ready.
Well, I think that's such a good point. You know, it only takes one for it to be a busy season in your neighborhood. Now, of course, we're also looking at the potential, that absence of El Nino. So for our viewers, what kind of impact can that have on a hurricane season for the Atlantic?
In a typical El Nino year, you really don't see as much activity in the Atlantic. A La Nina, more activity in the Atlantic. And by the way, it's the opposite for the Pacific. Our area that we cover actually goes from the European and African coast all the way to 140 west near Hawaii. So either way, we're always busy. It's either one basin or the other or both. So it really depends on those global patterns. So this year, it looks like more of a La Nina pattern. It looks to be an active season. So circling back once again, being ready for that is going to be key.
What are some ways that us as broadcast meteorologists can help you all relay that message to the public?
Yeah, it's interesting. You use the word message, and it's such an important word because, if you think about it, we've taken care of the science, and the science is getting, more advanced. We're getting so much better with that forecast. But even a perfect forecast, it doesn't do much good unless it's message, unless it's actionable and somebody can do something with that. And so being together, doing interviews like this, and being together during the storm, I think it's everything. I think we're all part of one team saving lives, and that should let people know that we're all in this together.
Well, and of course, we thank Ken for his time and just for all the work that him and his team are doing around the clock. I mean, we talk about the Atlantic Basin, the Pacific Basin, and as we've seen, Wes, we don't have to be June 1st to November 30th to have that activity. There's weather 24/7, and they are working at 24/7 around the clock.
Yeah, they're always staffed down there in Miami. He's been the director for 2 years now, but before that, he spent more than 20 years in Louisiana, which knows a thing or two about hurricanes. He was also a TV meteorologist in Mississippi, so he knows hurricanes, and more importantly, he can communicate that information well to all of us during a hurricane, right?
Well, that is just so crucial and such an important point that they're so good at that. And as Ken said, we can have that perfect forecast, but the message, we have to have a way to relay that to the public so they can prepare and stay safe. I mean, we don't know what this season or any season is going to bring, but we know that we can take the time now to prepare for whatever comes our way.
Okay, Melissa Lefevre here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Thank you so much. All right, so the Atlantic hurricane season starts today, but the Pacific hurricane season started on May 15th. And like we're learning right now, every once in a while, something on the Pacific side could cross over to the Atlantic side. Remember, Tropical Depression 3 actually started as Tropical Storm Amanda on the Pacific side. They have a whole different set of names I'll show you in a second. So occasionally, we want to look out here and see what's going on. They have the intertropical convergence zone just above the equator where they typically get some activity. That's that line of clouds that you're seeing here in the bottom of your screen. But right now, there's nothing that looks all that impressive that could be forming next for our friends on the other side of the ocean. So there's also a little area of low pressure, that little spinning you see, that little area of clouds heading for Southern California. Again, no potential tropical formation with that one, but they've started busy too with Amanda already checked off the list. The 2020 storm names for the eastern Pacific Ocean started with Amanda. Next up will be Boris and Christina, and there is the rest of the list of 21 storm names. All right, now I'd like to head north and bring in Tony Petracca from WPRI TV in Providence, Rhode Island. Tony, the season started today, but the last couple months have been filled with forecasts, and you've spent a lot of time dissecting them. Start us off tonight and tell us what you found.
Well, Wes, it seems like, everyone is on the sort of the same page as far as the season being an active one, both from the government, from NOAA, and from private sectors as well. I mean, you had mentioned already 2 named storms during the month of May and already watching that system in the Gulf of Mexico. So getting a head start, the last 4 seasons were very active, and that trend may continue for yet another season. Let's first take a look at the NOAA forecast from the government. Now, this was issued actually last week, and nothing really shy about the numbers here. That they're pretty aggressive when you keep in mind as far as the average number of storms that we get during a typical year. Named storms 12, and NOAA going with a pretty hefty number here on the order of 13 to 19 named storms. Now, on average during a typical hurricane season, getting about 6, and the NOAA forecast number is 6 to 10, and of those 6 to 10 hurricanes, 3 to 6 have the potential to be major hurricanes, meaning Category 3 or higher. Of course, the average for a given year is 3. So those numbers are elevated, and their confidence level is pretty high. We think about this, looking at the pie chart, 60%. They have a 60% chance, they feel as though, that the season will be above normal, with a 30% chance that it's a near normal season, and only a 10% chance that it's below normal. So we're talking at up to 90% chance that the season is either normal or above normal. We've seen some forecasts from other private sectors and universities talking about perhaps even a hyperactive season. Taking a look at a couple of universities now, one of the more well-known ones, both Colorado State and North Carolina, for the tropical research that they've been doing. Colorado State started under the direction of the late Dr. William Gray, putting out these forecasts starting like 37 years ago, and North Carolina State as well. So the Colorado State forecast going with 16 named storms, 8 of which would be hurricanes and 4 intense. And looking at some of the research from North Carolina, 18 to 22 named storms, well above average. Of that, 8 to 11 would be hurricanes, and of those hurricanes, 3 to 5 would be major hurricanes. I did note that in looking at some of the North Carolina research, they're really honing in on perhaps a hyperactive season in the Gulf of Mexico. The waters in the Gulf of Mexico really unusually warm. So when we look at some of the other private sectors that are out there putting out, and very reliable sectors at that, putting out forecasts, the 12 sectors that we were looking at, private sectors, businesses, all predict an active or hyperactive hurricane season coming up. Of course, the season runs now through November, Wes. So yeah, the numbers are pretty high, and everyone seems to be on board with a season that, much like the last 4, may be pretty active.
And hyperactive, that's a scary word to use this time of year. A lot of factors go into these forecasts, Tony, between El Nino and ocean temperatures, global warming. What do these forecasters that you've researched look at most?
Well, by far, the biggest driver here, really with all weather, but it's particularly with hurricane forecasts, are the oceans. It's not just a source of moisture, obviously, but a source of heat and some energy. And it's not so much the sea surface temperatures, but also the sea surface temperature anomalies. In other words, where's the water running warmer or cooler? So the blue colors represent cooler than average temperatures, but notice in the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and this region right in here, which we call the MDR, it is the region where most of our hurricanes form. In this part of the Atlantic, sea surface temperatures are running above average. It represents energy content within the oceans, and these storms feed on waters that are very warm, and even up and down the East Coast, water temperatures running above average as well. And you heard Dr. Graham talk about, it's not just the Atlantic Ocean, but what's going on as far as sea surface temperatures across the equatorial Pacific and this region right in here. They've become almost household names. El Nino and La Nina. El Nino being warmer than average temperatures in this part of the Pacific, and then La Nina being cooler. So we're seeing signs of kind of a neutral to borderline La Nina setting up, and that tends to favor storms forming in the Atlantic. But why are we looking out here if we're concerned about storms that are in the Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean? Well, El Nino and La Nina, or lack of either one, impacts the wind circulations in the upper levels of the atmosphere. How the winds are moving across the northern hemisphere and the jet stream. So it impacts how the wind flows at high levels of the atmosphere across the continental U.S. and even out into the Atlantic. Now, hurricanes are very finicky, very sensitive. They need the conditions to be just right in terms of sea surface temperature and also the wind in the upper levels of the atmosphere. These storms don't like to be environments where the wind around them is very, very strong. Of course, the storm itself is an entity of strong wind, but they don't like to pass through environments where the wind is very strong. We call that wind shear. When that happens, storms get sort of stretched apart and torn apart, and they have a hard time developing. Or you may get a strong hurricane for a couple of days, but when it encounters high wind shear, it falls apart. And with a La Nina favoring weaker wind shear, it favors development of storms. So in other words, they're easy to form, and then once they form and maintain their strength, they have more of a longer life cycle than had the wind shear been high. So quite simply, sea surface temperatures anomalies out in the Pacific have an impact on wind shear, which in turn can impact the development of these storms. And we're indicating this season that most of the time in the Atlantic, Atlantic, and the wind shear values will be low enough for these storms to form. Also, one other thing, even looking at weather patterns off the coast of Africa, what we call the monsoon season, you get these little impulses off the coast of Africa, and the more you have, the better chances you have of storms developing. One of the worst storms here in New England back in 1938 actually had its origins near Cape Verde, Wes, and off the coast of Africa, and it made that long trip across the Atlantic because it never had any wind shear to tear it apart.
All right, Tony, busy season. We're going to leave it there for now. Hopefully we will not be talking to you again later this season, but I know for more than 30 years you've taken care of things up in Rhode Island. People don't often think of Rhode Island getting storms, but you guys have had some big ones over the year. You can check Tony out at WPRI up in Providence, Rhode Island. And guess what, everyone? That's going to do it for us for our first episode of the season. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Tracking the Tropics. Next week, we move to our normal time, Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, then every week for the rest of the hurricane season. We appreciate you spending part of your night with us. Live in Raleigh, North Carolina, I'm Wes Hohenstein. Take care.